Welcome to Zero to Hero, Running a Tabletop Session 0 by Captain Mike, which by a remarkable coincidence is me. So we're all in the right place. As a brief aside, I see many people out here. Has anybody here, this is their first MAGFest? Ooh. Anybody here, this is like 5 or more MAGFests? Yeah. Oh, and me. Did somebody say this is your second? All right, any second MAGFests? Yeah, nice, welcome back. First one was 2019. 2019 was only like last year, dude. Yes, so I'm Captain Mike, and you know what, let's just get rolling, but very briefly, I sometimes have difficulty recognizing people, especially in crowds. This particular class was not my idea. Someone had recommended, or asked me if I was going to do a class about this, and so, or a panel about this, and so I put it together. Is that person here now? Oh, he's going to be so disappointed. That's okay. What's that?
Maybe they'll show up later.
Maybe they will. Maybe they'll catch it on YouTube around March or May or June. And maybe it will be actually recorded properly. Who knows? All right, well, let's get rolling. So, I am Captain Mike. I started playing role-playing games many years ago with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons before they needed to tell you what edition it was. And then moved on to 2nd edition and then got dragged kicking and screaming into 5th edition fairly recently. But I do play a wide variety of other role-playing games, including but not limited to Champions, Star Wars, the D6 version, a handful of D20 games, and a bunch of the White Wolf, especially the older White Wolf, Vampire, Werewolf, etc. And a bunch of other smatterings here and there. But I always kind of go back to Dungeons & Dragons as like my first one, because that was the first game that I played way back when I created a character and I had no idea what I was doing. But I always think of myself as having these 6 stats. I am a presenter. I am also an actual teacher, if you can believe that people will trust me with that sort of thing. I have an MA in writing, a BA in English, 30-something years of role-playing. Like I said, I'm also a teacher, which is pretty impressive for a 29-year-old. This is so weird. The laptop behind me does not show the thing that's over here, so when I tell the thing to advance, I'm like, why doesn't it show the thing? But I promise I will only trip over that a few times. Likewise this. Now, has anybody here been to one of my panels before? Any return people? Ooh, nice, thank you for coming back. But if you are coming back, then you have undoubtedly seen this before, or most likely seen this before. Anytime I talk about role-playing games, I always give the same piece of advice. And indeed, anything that I say from here on out is just advice and stuff that you can take, ignore, modify, whatever, but if you only take away 3 words, it is this piece of advice, which is the best advice I can give to anybody about just about anything under almost any circumstances, and that is to know your audience. Nothing is so useful as knowing and understanding the people that you are gaming with, both in terms of being a game master, understanding the players and what they want and what they need and what they are looking for, but also as a player, understanding what your other players are looking for and what they need, and what your game master is looking for and what they need. You're all in this together, we're all in this together. The more you know about other people, the better. Now, session 0, being the session that comes before the actual game itself, is a great time to know your audience, or a great place to get to know your audience. It's always a great time to know your audience. Oh, sorry, I'm a little out of breath, because for some mysterious reason around my torso. The penalties for looking good. But knowing your audience is super critical. Anything else, just advice, and I'm going to be talking about ways to get to know your audience, and especially in the terms of what they're looking for in a role-playing game and what they're looking to get out of the role-playing game, and maybe what they're looking to put into it. Oh, and if at any point you have any questions or you want me to go into some greater detail about things, do feel free to ask. You can raise your hand because I am a teacher and I recognize that, but you can also shout it out because I'm a teacher and I recognize that. Also, if you want me to provide you with the slides, you can send me an email at the email located at the bottom of the screen on just about every slide, and I will have that at the end as well, in case you wanted to take a closer look in, I don't know, spend a few hours perusing my 8-slide PDF. Well, let's talk about what is a session zero. Session zero, normally when we think about getting together to do some gaming, we're like, okay, we're gonna get together and we're gonna game. And sometimes we're like, yeah, we're just gonna jump right into it. But that's never really the case, is it? Under the best of circumstances, there is setup, there is prep, and with most of the people I know, there's an awful lot of scheduling. Man, the older I never thought I'd be like, oh, I miss high school when I had such a regular schedule. I don't miss high school. But it was kind of nice to know that, like, okay, school was from like this time to this time or whatever. And for some of us, we have very regular schedules. Oh, I go to work at 9, I get off work at 5. I've never had one of those jobs, but which may be hard to believe. But yeah, it's like, oh, I go to work at 3 and I come home at 9:30. I'm trying to schedule with my friends, and it's like, one, half of us are in a different time zone. And I see a lot of people nodding on that one. It's definitely an element of the age. You know, it's like, oh, what time can you get on Discord? It's no longer like, whose house are we going to hang out at? It's like, when can we get on Discord? When? Okay, well, if the kids are in bed, then I can game, but you have to go to bed early because you have to get up at 6 a.m. for your shift, and it's a nightmare. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But a session, there's always that kind of thing. And even if you make the characters ahead of time, even if you're using a pre-planned sort of a module or something like that, there's always that prep work. And if you're working with players who may be new to either the system or new to role-playing in general, there's always that sort of like rules barrier. So a session zero is, you know what, we're not going to game today. We are going to get ready to game today. So that way when we are ready and we actually do all get together, boom, we can hit the ground running, no muss, no fuss. You don't necessarily, by the way, have to do your session zero with everybody at once. It's super convenient. And a lot of the stuff I talk about, we'll talk about like making sure that you have kind of a simpatico adventuring party and things are all together. But, I mean, if you need to, break it up into 2 sets, because if you can only meet once every 3 months, you kind of want that once every 3 months to be the actual game itself. So, we'll be talking about like establishing ground rules and limits, determining setting specifics, making important characters, the setting expectations, and of course, the scheduling, which is always the hardest part. That's the real monster of Dungeons & Dragons. All right. Establishing ground rules and limits. By the way, these are in no particular order. You don't have to be like, well, we did that, so now we move on to that. Jeez, I'm not that regimented. So, ground rules. What system are you playing? I mentioned earlier that I was dragged kicking and screaming into Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And that's a big thing. When I get together with my friends, we all kind of grew up through the D&D editions. And so we're like, okay, so we're doing like 2nd edition. Some of them are like 3rd edition. Some of them are like 4th edition. I'm like, heretic. And then, you know, we've kind of settled on 5th edition because like, all right, it's the new thing. We should really keep with the times. But you might also consider things like house rules. Like, even something as simple as like, if I roll a d20 and it rolls off the table and onto the floor, does that count? No. Oh, there is not a consensus in this room. I'm looking out there, I see people like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, no, that's such bull honky. This will eventually be on YouTube, so I want to keep it something that can be seen. They're like, no, that's terrible. That's heretical. Rolling dice and hitting the floor. Other people are like, no, whatever it rolls, that's what it is. If you have to move the armoire, we find out if that's a 19 or a 20. But you kind of want to know that because you don't want to wait for like that to happen and then have to, the whole thing grinds to a halt and then there's a conversation about it and then you may end up with a group that where half of them are like one way, half of them are the other way. And you may even be more specific. Maybe you're like, it only counts if it goes in the dice rolling little device or the little platform or use the dice tower, whatever it is you need. And the expansions and third-party rules, I don't know if any of you have ever been in a gaming session and somebody's like, I want to use this third-party add-on, and everyone just goes, what does it do? And then they read off like their class abilities, and it's like, oh, immune to damage, plus 30 to hit any living thing, plus 40 to hit any non-living thing. I'm like, where did you get this? I was like, oh, I got it from Greg's Discount Absolutely Real DNDsupplies.com. Like, that's an extremely long URL. So, sorry. So if you know which expansions you're doing, which parts you're using, very handy. A lot of the further expansions often get more and more unbalanced, but if you use all of them, they kind of balance themselves out with their own sort of imbalance. To take a very specific example, anybody remember 2nd edition D&D? It's okay if you don't want to admit it. But yeah, some people. Does anybody remember the class handbooks? Now the eyes start rolling. The fighter's handbook, the thieves handbook, the elves handbook. I know what elves are in a class, but you know what I mean. And each one of those had so many additional rules and little abilities that you could take. And then they had a skills and powers book, which allowed you to min-max the ever-loving heck out of your character. Bonkers. But if you use them all together, at least everybody kind of had the same bonkers stuff, so it kind of balanced out. But if you had just one person playing it, it was a real pain because they had all this special stuff that they could do, and the rest of us were like, I guess I'll roll to hit. And that was about the alpha and omega. So you want to make sure that those are even. And speaking of those, psionics. Does anyone remember when someone would bring a psionic into an otherwise ordinary D&D game? So, for those of you who aren't familiar, D&D, a classic fantasy setting, there were psionics introduced in actually in 1st edition. 2nd edition, they were unhinged, unchained. They were a game unto themselves. So if you brought one in, it basically just tore through everything because nothing had defense against their powers. So you could either prepare for a psionic party, or you could prepare for literally anyone else, but you couldn't really do both. And if someone just springs that on the GM, or if someone springs that on the rest of the party, well, it's like being on a team with Batman, Robin, and Superman, and Thanos. All right.
Perfectly balanced.
Somebody said it was pretty balanced?
Perfectly balanced.
Perfectly balanced, as all things should be. Thank you. Making parties is a snap. Breaking parties is a snap. So those are all fine. Also, game limits, because even if you're okay, we've got the mechanics, we know this thing, we're doing these characters, and blah, 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 whatever, Mike. Consider what genre you're playing. Sometimes people are are we in a fun punch-em-up action movie kind of a genre? And other people are we're in a dismal noir sort of a setup. I was those two don't really get along together all the time, but I mean, Batman animated series did it, so maybe you can. But if you're all on the same page, then it's much easier, because it's hard to have someone who's emoting on a Shakespearean level, playing, I don't know, the bard, trying to bring groups together to avoid conflict, and then someone's I bet these guys are worth 20 experience each, and that means a big ding for this bro. Killer. Other limits character mortality. I mean, some people are pretty hardcore, and they're hey, if my character dies, they die, and I'm just rolling up another one because this dungeon is a meat machine, and that's what I'm here for. But other people get really attached to their characters, and the characters themselves are the core of the adventure, not the adventure being a thing that pulls the characters along. And so if their characters die, they really feel they're now going to be separate or other from the rest of the thing. Which is fine. I mean, fear of death is what motivates a lot of role-playing characters. Not as much as you might think based on how they try to get around my traps, but it's supposed to be.
Or walk right into it.
Yeah, I mean,
Do not open with face.
that's what followers are for, right? So character mortality, that may be something that you discuss. If your characters die, what happens? Do you just re-roll another character? Do we wait to the next arc to introduce a new one? Do we anticipate that if a character dies, there's going to be I don't know, some sort of afterlife quest, which sometimes happens? Do you have resurrections? Can anyone just pop a phoenix down and then, boop, maybe. And likewise character restrictions. I talked a little bit about the psionic characters from D&D. But any kind of character restrictions. For a while I was playing a lot of the Champions, the role-playing game, using the hero system, because superheroes are cool. And we would be okay, well, what kinds of characters are we playing? And I'm okay, I don't want to get into I don't know, psychic characters, because the rules for psychic characters are very difficult and different. What is it about psychic characters that throw everything off? We can do fireballs, but apparently we can't do telepathy. So you might have character restrictions. Even within something like Dungeons & Dragons, you might be like, okay, we're playing a party that is no evil characters. Like, this adventure is like neutral or good, and that's it. Conversely, you might have the opposite. A friend of mine ran a campaign for a few years, which was a ton of fun, and it was called the Criminals Campaign, because he was like, I'm sick of playing good people. Let's play a bunch of terrible people. And so we did, and so it actually had a limit where none of us could play good characters, because we were essentially the mafia. You know, fantasy mafia. I played a hobgoblin. It was really cool. I could tell you about it later, but I can't sit here and talk about old war stories. Now, these are both kinds of things that you discuss with basically any gaming group, but also especially like, it's a friendly kind of a thing. What do we just all want? What do we all go for? You might have some formal options, especially if you have a gaming group that is not like just a friend group. Like if you're meeting together with, well, honestly, these days there are a bunch of apps. You could meet together with a bunch of randos. And that's super cool, but you might need some more formal options, or you might, if you're like bringing a few groups together or something like that, you might consider these things. So you might have a code of conduct. My friends and I don't have a code of conduct because if we think your conduct is lousy, we stop being your friend. It's that simple. But you might have a code of conduct where you actually say like, okay, well if somebody does something that breaches etiquette, what happens? What do we do? Do we have like a 3 strikes and you're out thing? Do we do like, whatever system you feel is necessary? But it's worth figuring out before it happens. Likewise, breaches of conduct. So what do we do? Do we kick them out of the gaming group? Do we penalize them experience points? Yes?
Is that in-game or out-of-game?
Could be, do you mean like in-game conduct? Like if my character stabs your character and that's frowned upon, or?
Like derailing story versus...
Oh, see, I don't even differentiate on that one. The suggestion was like derailing a story in terms of that. So like if I have a player who derails a story, that's really kind of, it depends. Like, because I've had people, almost all of my games have been derailed because that is the nature of role-playing games. The only thing you plan is the one thing that you know will never happen. So if it's just like they blow a roll, they do something that I just had no idea they were going to do, or something, fine, fair. In fact, I consider that part of the game. But yeah, don't mess with me. Yeah, you better. Showed him. Anyway, but if you've got someone who's just like, they're just derailing the situation because they just want to ruin the game, and like ruining the game is fun for them, and they're just frustrating other players. Yeah, you gotta do something. Either be like, hey, what's going on? Is this about something else? Are you just like mad or frustrated? Do you not want to be here? Which may sound like silly, like why would you be there if you don't want to be there? There are lots of times where people show up to role-playing games and they don't want to be there. It could be because their friends are all there, so they feel like they have to be there, and they're kind of trying to like sabotage the game, because if they sabotage the game, then they can go do something else that they think is more fun, or they might be trying to sabotage the game because they're just trying to get attention or be a jerk. So that kind of thing, like that code of conduct, that can be used in that, where they're like, we all recognize that you're just derailing this, so you're out. Or, it sounds very mafia-like, so you're out of the family. But I think it's worth kind of considering what those things are, and I really feel like that's not really a friendly sort of a thing, but if you recognize that you're meeting up at the gaming store with some people and anybody can come in, or if you have like an after-school club, it may be worth having those things kind of set ahead of time. And in such a way that everybody agrees that they're reasonable. Cancellation, by which I mean like canceling sessions. Some people have rules about that because their schedules are very specific, and so they're like, well, if we're going to cancel a session, I want to know before, 24 hours before, because I need to schedule my work schedule around it, and if I don't have to go gaming, then I really need these other things that I would be able to, that I would need to do. And maybe for many people this is nothing. You don't need any particular rules for it, but these are options. And adding players. You know, games move along and people may become interested, and so you may find yourself with people who are like, hey, can I get in on this game? And if you're playing with people who are not just a friend group, or even with a friend group, you might be like, well, hey, how do we add players? How do we modify the campaign? Do we allow players to jump in, like between arcs, or maybe in the middle of arcs or something like that? How do we handle that? Yeah, ooh, question.
I know this is for setting plans, but if you're doing a quick pickup at a con,
If you're doing a quick pickup at con,
or just a table of randos, you're not going to do something, there's some tips for the speedrunner.
so if I were doing just a pickup game at a con table or something like that, first of all, adding players would probably be the easiest, the one where I'm like, yes, it just happens, sit down. Because we're just hanging out at a con, there's no formality to that. The code of conduct I would expect to be pretty much the same as the con, but for something like that I would have probably characters pre-made, people just kind of sit down and we just run with it. I'm like, hey, here's the quick catch up on what's going on, let's go do some stuff. And I have run a few games at cons where it is just kind of a pickup game like that. It's extremely loose and I make it very clear to all the players, like, this is not a serious game, so we can just be cool. That would be my advice. Yes?
So in a situation where like you're gaming with like randoms or like trying to get people for like an online game or something, do you have any particular like questions or like questions to ask them like in order to vet sort of like their fit in the game, the potential like proper player, or
To like,
whether they fit the vibe essentially?
Okay, so the question was, do I have any advice for like vetting players? I don't have any great advice. Like, I can't just be like, do this and you're solid.
Do you like pineapple on pizza?
Yeah, do you like pineapple on pizza? Because if that's a question that you have a very strong opinion on, I'm not sure I necessarily want to game with you. I just got kicked out of a gaming group.
That's your joke, and they laugh. They're in.
I'm kidding, I grew up in New Jersey. That's a terrible idea, pineapple on pizza. Anyway, that can be very tricky, and it's also, I mean, there's a lot of kind of things that go into it and determine like what it is that you're looking for. Now, if I'm expecting to be hanging out with Randall Calrissian, I understand that by nature, that player is a wild card, and we're just gonna have to see how it goes. Now, if I'm inviting people to my house to be like, let's all sit down and do some good old-fashioned tabletop, I'm going to know that person pretty well. So there's that kind of a thing. Usually what I do is I ask them about other stuff that they've done regarding like other games that they've played and how that happened and how that, you know, how things went down, and I try to get a vibe for just how they approach gaming in general. And I also do that not only to see if they're going to be like a problem player, but also because I just want to know, are they going to vibe with how I game? Like, I game on a more story-based sort of a thing, so if I've got someone who's like trying to power level, I'm like, I mean, that's cool, but that's just not what I do. So none of my stories revolve around that. None of my characters kind of vibe with that idea. So I find that that's just asking them about what's going on. And if they're new to role-playing, then I'm like, hey, blank slate, wild card, but this could be the chance to teach them like some good gaming etiquette. But I might ask them about like other social stuff that they do. All right, moving along. So determining setting specifics. This is something that sometimes gets glossed over a little bit more than I think that it should be, which is why I made an entire slide for it. No, setting specifics are maybe very simple. Oh, we're going to play in Ravenloft, because that's Dungeons and Dragons, and it's a gloomy atmosphere, and it's like bada bing, bada boom. But you might be like, oh, okay, well, we want to play in a D&D world that is not one of the specific prescribed ones, and here's the kind of like vibe that I'm going for. But also consider your scope and scale. Are these going to be characters who are going to be going across like epic lands from the Shire to Mordor? Or are they going to be adventuring roughly as far as Bree? That's a nerdy-ass reference, but hey, what the heck, it's MAGFest. So, scope, scale, and likewise a character. Ooh, questions? Do you mean, when you say role-playing experience, do you mean like acting? Oh, okay. Yeah, because oftentimes you have the person who's like, you know, okay, I roll my to hit, and I do 20 damage. Okay, then I cast the spell and it does 6 damage. And the next person is like, forsooth. As I understand it, the Crimson Dragon stands upon a spire, which inspires me. And then, yeah. That can be kind of tough, and actually that's part of one of the things about like managing expectations, because then you can kind of get an idea of like if you have an entire group of the bard, or if you have an entire group of the hack and slash. And certainly I think that the combination is actually the best. As a GM, I try to give each person a chance to be in the spotlight, but I also try to make sure that they have roughly equal times in the sense that they get as much as they want. Some players, they're there to hit things and they just want to do damage and they're more concerned with the mechanics. And other people really want that chance to orate. You know, they want the chance to, you know, try out for the big play at the end of the session, which is totally cool. And also I'll interact with them more in terms of NPCs, but I'll maybe like TLDR some of the interactions with, you know, the more hack and slash players. I kind of take that as a player by player thing. And as long as the players between themselves don't mind, it's not a problem. All right, where was I? Oh yeah, setting specifics. Character connections can also be one of those things where you can be like, okay, so we're playing Star Wars and we're all from the same planet, or we're playing Dungeons & Dragons and we're all from the same city or something like that. You don't have to do those things, but if you get those things that kind of out of the way ahead of time, it gets around those kind of awkward starting conversations like, I'm the best thief in Waterdeep. And the next person's like, I am also the best thief in Waterdeep.
The rivalry is intense.
Now, yes, and certainly you could, now if you know that, you can prepare and be like, well, clearly, this is a rivalry. It's like a whole West Coast, East Coast thing for Waterdeep. And it sounded great, actually. So you can totally do that, but having a session 0 where you get those things ready ahead of time gives, at the very least, the GM a chance to put in all of that kind of stuff, and rather than having to like wing the idea that 2 or maybe more of their characters are the best thief in Waterdeep. So just to give you an idea of the different concepts of setting and scope and scale in terms of setting, consider this first one. We've got London, England, 1914, regular timeline, real world, and the PCs are spies. Very simple. It's a World War I spy game. Everyone's on board. They know what the real world is like, and if they want to know what was going on, they can just check Wikipedia, because it was World War I. Which, in case you're not sure, was in the past. But then, what if you were playing in London, England, 1914? Fairly regular timeline, but there are secret vampires who have been controlling things from the shadows. Well, okay, cool. That still gives us a pretty reasonable place to go from. We don't need a lot of prep work for that, because we can just assume any truly terrible stuff in history was probably the fault of vampires, but everything still played out the same, so I can still use Wikipedia if I need to. Oh, and the PCs are vampires. Okay, well now I just need to know the vampire rules. But suppose you're going not just from London, England to the British Isles as a whole, so now I'm like, okay, I could be going all over the place. I could go to Cork or Bath or other places I've heard of in England. I'm kidding, Cork and Bath are both extremely lovely. But then we live in a world with metahumans and psychic powers and actual ghosts. And it's mostly regular timeline, except for the part where there's metahumans and psychic powers and ghosts, and that kind of switches some stuff up. And the PCs are super soldiers for the First World War, which I think was actually a role-playing game for a while, now that I think about it out loud. But I don't remember the name of it, and it didn't last very long. But at least if we know that things still kind of turned out okay, but it turns out that like Elizabeth I could breathe fire, but it still turned out about the same, so I can still kind of get an idea of what I could reasonably assume was the history of the world, and now I know I'm going to be like all over England. Cool. But then you can get even weirder, like maybe it's Europe and it's 1914. There's metahumans and psychics and ghosts, and it was a steampunk world, because with those things, steam became the major power, and we didn't bother as much with coal. And now the American colonies failed to revolt because England wasn't as strong a superpower, and the Aztec Empire remains because the Spanish weren't able to defeat their psychic wizards. Well, if we know this ahead of time, we can give a lot of backstory, because if you're asking players to walk into that, what are they supposed to even think? Like, what does 1914 even mean at that point? Like, we have lost so much of our frame of reference. We kind of need some footing. It's like, okay, so where are we? What are we doing? And what should I know? And then the GM can impart the information like, okay, if your character's from here, then you know these things. If your character's from here, you know these things. But it's kind of nice to know when you're sitting down to just get ready to go, and you're like, I gotta get in character and know what my rolls are and my stats are. It's nice to know that if you're like, okay, well, it's 1914, so I'll just, fly a biplane. And they're like, oh, biplanes don't exist, but you can use a spirit blimp. I'm like, okay, that's cool. I would have liked to have known what that was before it happened. And it's like, well then, do I get a pistol? They had pistols in 1914. And it's like, well, you could, but you could also use a magic wand that you could buy from the corner store for a pound. Oops, a shilling. 1914, they still had shillings. And it gives the players a much stronger sense of what they're doing and where they are, and it also gives them the ability to plan both in concept of like what they want their characters to be, but also like what they can say and do and interact with. Like what can they reasonably see in their world. Cool? Yeah, I see a lot of nodding heads. So, making and coordinating characters. I'm going to run through these very quickly, but I want to tell you a story about something I think about whenever I think about making characters and whenever I think about a session zero. Way back when, I was hanging out with some friends, and we all got together for a party. And because we're a bunch of nerds, it turned into a big old gaming session, because that's what we did. But we were like, we're just going to jump in. It's Dungeons & Dragons. You just roll the dice 6 times. Those are your stats. Make characters. We're all reasonably familiar with the rules, so blah, 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 blah. And then we're going around, and we're meeting in, and this may blow some of your minds, a tavern. Which, yeah. Look, we didn't have any time to plan. We didn't do a session zero. There were barely any ideas. The GM was just like, I got an idea for a story that I've been working on. We'll just go ahead and wing it. So we get together, and most of us are like, I'm a paladin, and I believe in holy light, or whatever. Which is not a very convincing thing for a paladin to say. But then we had one person where we were like, hey, stranger, you haven't said anything. Who are you? He's like, I don't think that's your business. And you can almost like hear the grit and the spit, and like there's a spittoon in the corner. I was like, okay, so he's the grim silent type. Then we had like a bard who's like, I love to sing. And then it went to another person. And we were like, so who are you? And he's like, yeah, I don't think you need to know my name either. And then the growly first one is like, well, I don't think that's right. Who are you, stranger? I don't think that's something you need to know. Who do you think you are? This went on for like 5-10 minutes. Just a growl off as the two of them are like, I'm dark and broody, and the other one's like, I'm broodier and darker. You couldn't even take it seriously. That was the real tragedy. As a result, neither one of them could be taken seriously in even the slightest. But if we had had a chance to coordinate characters, we could have been like, okay, one of you can be the dark, broody, growly type that we drag along, but it turns out you have a heart of gold or whatever. You can't just both have this, like, 10 paces growl off. You can't all be Strider, for crying out loud. Or Aragorn, either one. I didn't get nearly as many laughs as I thought of it. So, when you're making and coordinating your characters, it's often worth considering, are you making a coherent team? And I feel I should point out that if you're not, are you prepared for that? Because that can be fun. Having a wildly unbalanced team, something that is extremely good at one thing and incredibly bad at everything else, that can be a lot of fun. Any Final Fantasy players out there? Party of 4 white mages? There it is. Okay, Final Fantasy crowd. All right, not a Lord of the Rings crowd. Was not expecting that one. Yeah, Party of 4 white mages can be a lot of fun. It's an interesting challenge. I had a couple of friends, we were like, okay, let's get together. They had pre-existing characters that we'd all gamed with before, and they were like, let's take these guys on an adventure, and like, a very lengthy combat action later, and I'm like, oh, you're all fighters. Oh boy. Not a healing potion in the bunch. So, wow, did they drag them? But you know what? Awesome, because rather than being the get in a fight, and by the way, this was before long rests and short rests and regaining all your hit points, you regained 1 hit point a night, 2 if you took it easy, and thank you those of you who are nodding and making me feel less old. Again, very impressive for a 29-year-old, no? But yeah, and so it became like this actually surprisingly gritty game of Dungeons & Dragons where like every fight they took, they had to be incredibly careful to get hurt as little as possible because they did not have the option to get healed. And they would have to take like a week to try to like get themselves back together enough that they could like go on against the next thing. And at the end, they like stole the bad guy's ring of regeneration and they were passing it back and forth like a ridiculous game of volleyball because he would boosh, hit one of them and it's like, what are you at? I'm at 1 hit point. They're like, here you go. Whoosh. And I know that's not how the ring of regeneration works, but I didn't care because that was badass. Oh my god, they're like, oh, I got stabbed in the throat, I'm over here, and then they'd have to roll to throw it, and then they missed it a couple of times, and they'd have to go scrambling after it. Meanwhile, the bad guy's like smashing houses in the background. Oh, awesome. So an unbalanced team can be fun, but it helps to be prepared. And that way, again, you're all on board. But if you're like, oh, we want a balanced team, so we have some healing, we have some magic, we have some fighters, we have some super spies, we have some spider people, whatever it is that you're doing. One time I was playing a Marvel superhero game, and it did come down to, okay, well, we've got someone who can do magic, someone who can fight things, and Mike, you play a spider person, that's always good too. I was like, thanks.
Like a person who is a spider or like Spider-Man?
Like Spider-Man.
Okay, less fun, but still much fun.
Yes, I mean, well, as long as you have some sort of arachnid influence in your spider team, you're solid. Because DC has a Spider-Man too. They call him the Spider. And it certainly is not Spider-Man, despite the wisecracking and the sticking to walls and the shooting the webs. But he's a bad guy, because Spider's bad. The Marvel DC stuff is crazy. So, coherent team, necessary character classes. If you're planning a game that like needs a character class, a session 0 is a great way to ensure that someone is that character class. If you need someone who can cast Dispel Magic, if you need someone who can check for traps, if you need someone who can read German, yeah. I was at a LARP one time, and the whole thing hinged on there being someone with like the engineering feat. And I was new, it was my first LARPing time, I had never played before, and my plan was to be involved only sort of generally to see how things went. Turns out I was the only person who had thought to take the engineering feat, and I was like, you've got to be kidding me, I don't know what I'm doing. Your plan was just to hinge everything on this, and out of, by the way, that's a 40-person LARP. One dope in the corner is like, I got an engineering feat. They're like, well, it all comes down to you. I know, right? What's up?
I actually had a game I was a part of, had left for a while and rejoined relatively recently. It's a homebrew setting in the D&D universe. It's kind of like One Piece inspired, hop into violence.
One Piece inspired D&D homebrew sounds cool.
It's a thing. My character, again, joined originally a druid, party sealer. I had to leave for scheduling reasons, joined in later. In this one, I made a dragonborn bard.
Dragonborn bard? Dragonborn
who wants to utilize the power of song and story to become an actual dragon. Here's the problem. The rest of the party is a warlock, sorcerer, ranger. We have three charisma-based people.
3 charisma-based people. That's the opposite of most of my gaming groups.
Very persuasive party.
Very persuasive party. None of us could actually roll well on our persuasion.
Which, but not, man, when the dice turn, they turn. Yeah, and that can be really interesting because now suddenly, though, you're all charisma-based, which means that now you have to start taking those avenues. But it's very helpful, especially in like a session 0, to get those things kind of worked out because then the DM knows what to prepare for. And hopefully you didn't just like jump into the session. You were like, I'm gonna play this character, and maybe the DM might have been like, gee, I sure hope we're not getting another charisma-based character. And you like had a few words.
Actually planned that beforehand. He was like, I want you to play a dragonborn because they're relevant to this island.
Oh,
I
nice.
love bards. I would love you to play a bard. Like that would be really cool because I hadn't played a bard.
So just so you can hear, the DM suggested that he play a Dragonborn and a Bard for story purposes, which is great because that means that it can really interlock with what's going on.
It took him until the end of the session to go, oh,
saying, give me a bard.
Yeah, right. Bards mean bards. Yes.
So just going back to like being able to choose necessary character classes, I have this one-shot plan where I want to basically everybody has to be a bard, but different subclasses.
Nice.
You're all going to be participating in a literal battle of the bands.
Battle of the bands. Everyone's a bard. I love it.
But it's like battle of the dead.
A battle of the bands where the penalty is death.
They don't know that until they get there.
That's metal. That is like, yeah. No, that's fantastic. But yeah, and for something like that, a session 0 would be a great time to first of all be like, look, you're all playing bards. Because otherwise some people might show up and be very surprised. But it also means that you can make sure that you're different types of bards, or at least maybe like a logical simpatico group, so that you of course have the grunge bard, and the metal bard, and the violin bard, and the lute bard.
And the drummer.
And the drummer, who is really a barbarian, I'm sure. So you can have necessary character class, you can have established relationships. If you're going to have characters that are related, it's kind of handy to iron that out ahead of time, especially if you have a character who's an orphan and someone else is playing their parent. The interwoven origin stories, you can figure out, like, hey, well, my character was, a product of, growing up in a poor neighborhood, and then there was a terrible experiment in the chemical factory across the way, and now they have superpowers, and then you can have someone else be like, I was in the chemical factory, and I got superpowers. I can't believe I was working on superpower chemicals. So you can kind of like make them all work together, and that makes for a world that's more integrated, and it can make the party already feel more cohesive, and you can kind of fast track the idea of a party working together. One of the things I love about a session 0 is that if someone is coming in and they're like, you know what, I don't know what to play. Maybe because it's their first time, maybe because it's the first time in the system, or maybe they're just sick of always playing the same type of character, and they're like, all I know is I don't want to play another fighter, or whatever. It can give ideas, because as people are like, oh, well, I could play this kind of a character or this kind of a character, it might be like, well, I choose this one, and the stock player may be like, but the one that you didn't choose, I'm going to go with that. Or they might say, well, if we've got all these characters but no spellcasters, I'll choose a spellcaster because I've never chosen that. And it can kind of help get those creative juices flowing, can kind of unstick the gears a little bit. Super handy, and especially handy with people who are newer to the system, because they can start hearing the different options, they can start hearing the different ideas, and even just getting general advice from other players. I'm making sure this thing doesn't turn off again. You can handle questions before the game, so if you're like, hey, can I do this? It's handy to have that happen on a session 0 instead of like session 1 where you show up and it's like, I've got a character made, and it's like, you can't use any of that. I'm like, oh, I wish I could have known the answers to those questions beforehand. And having everybody kind of doing it in one coordinated way means you don't have to send 30 emails. I mean, I don't know why you have a game with 30 players, but you don't have to send a bunch of emails back and forth to different people when you're really just saying the same thing. Or, let's face it, it's the 21st century, you could post it all to one Discord. But you can balance with established characters, so if you've got characters that are continuing and you've got new characters, you can kind of level up those new characters, make sure that you're all on the same playing field, everything's fair, and everyone feels like they have a useful part to play. And of course, you can get right into the action. Boop, boop, boop. Setting expectations and scheduling. These two I kind of push together because I feel like they're very similar. And these may seem kind of obvious, but I think it's worth thinking about it, and maybe even having a checklist, so that way you're not just suddenly all looking at each other like, so when are we going to meet? July? Is that good for anybody? So location, very handy. Where are you going to meet? And it's like, well, my apartment is too small, and I've got 60 kids, so I can't have anybody over my place, and I live in a dorm room, so, maybe we can figure, okay, well, we can meet in the library, we can meet at Jackie's place, we can meet, wherever. We can meet in the back room of a bar and pretend like we're mercenaries. You can decide on your gaming session length. Some people are like, I'm ready to game, I cleared my whole day for this, I'm ready to sit down for 6 hours of gaming. And someone else is like, I got 2 hours because that's all I could manage this month. That's my entire not doing work or family or chores budget for the month. Like, how long are you going to do it? And some people just don't want to game for 6 hours. Some people just don't want to game for fewer than 2 because they feel like as soon as they get into it, they have to get out of it. Both are extremely valid, And it really helps for everyone to know at least roughly how long things are going to go on for. It also really helps the GM in planning what you might be able to get through. And here's a hint, take that and cut it in half. Maybe cut it in half again. Dates and times, of course, very straightforward. Google Calendar is extremely useful to anyone who's trying to organize a gaming schedule, or if you use some other system, I guess. But also the session structure itself. Every week I meet with a bunch of friends. We've been meeting since high school. And we meet on Discord, and we meet on Sunday nights because it's the only time that we can all get online and be together and hang out. And we all know the first half hour is for catching up and generally, just kind of being jerks to each other and making fun of each other and telling people how the family are and all that kind of stuff. Just catching up. And if anybody's late, like they don't get there at 9 o'clock, like we don't panic or care. It's 9:30. Okay, that's when we're supposed to start. We recognize that as the starting time. And if we're going to be later than that, we're like, hey, just so you know. And we also know that if we're just getting into our stories and reminiscences, 9:30 is about when the GM's like, all right, pack it in, let's get some stuff done. And likewise, we know we're going to end at 11 o'clock. So we have that idea, we fit it into the schedule, and we all have that expectation. It doesn't have to be that rigid for everybody, but, it's nice to have. Who holds the character sheets? Who does hold the character sheets? Does the GM hold the character sheets so that they're all in one place? Does each player have the character sheets so they can check stuff on the way, when they're at home? And of course, I'm acting like character sheets are physical objects anymore. Does someone have a website where they have a repository for all the PDFs? Or is there a Google Drive where everyone has their stuff? And how do you know which file is the newest file so you know which character sheet you're using for whatever? My advice, session 0, figure it out. It saves a lot of trouble, a lot of headache down the road. Are books needed? This is especially handy for people who are just coming into the game. Do you actually need to have the books? Do you actually need to have the PDFs? Or can you use quick reference sheets? Do you need all of the stuff or some of the stuff? Do you need the player's handbook and also one of the other player's handbooks? Can you just use D&D Beyond and get away with that? Depends on what you're doing, and it depends on what you need. It's cool either way, but it's handy to know, especially because sometimes people will buy books because they thought they needed them. Well, it's a shame if they didn't. And nobody wants to show up to a gaming session and be like, oh, I didn't bring my whatever it is. How many players can be absent before a game gets canceled? For my gaming session, it's 2. That's the hard rule. If we're missing 2 people for any reason, we don't play, because it's too hard to catch people up, and it's too much to kind of assume what 2 different players are doing, because we have a group of 6 or 7. I forget how many friends I have. But that's a lot. That's a third of the group. For some of you, it may be 1. For some games, it may just take only 1 person to be out, because maybe the decisions are too critical, or maybe it's a particular person where it's well, for this session, if this person isn't there, we got nothing. So it depends. And if you only have a gaming group of 3 people, missing 1 is also a third. So, and what happens to their characters? If someone is absent, does the DM take control of them? Does the party sort of collectively assign actions to the character? Do they just kind of stand there in the corner, just attack, bonk, and just doing nothing? Do they get skill checks? Do they roll saving throws? Do they take damage? Can they die?
Yes.
Oh, I was going to say, the session that I was in last year, we basically just weekend at Bernie's any character.
We weekend at Bernie's to any character that didn't have a player. That's ridiculous.
There were a lot of people that were left in carts or just were passed out for a session, and we just had to carry them around.
Yeah, and sometimes, depending on the game that you're playing, the characters you have, and the players, because some players get really touchy if something happens to their character when they're not there. Again, know your audience. But yeah, certainly I've played characters where it's what did I do last session? It was you were drunk as a skunk the whole time, and I was that sounds about right. So I get out of the dumpster and try to find the party. Nothing like those medieval dumpsters behind the medieval TGI Fridays. Yeah, so there's lots of different things you can do, but really nice to just have that, again, just one of those things where you're like, hey, this is just on the checklist, what happens to the things? And you could indeed use this as a checklist, just to run down, make sure you didn't forget anything. Because then it simplifies the rest of the thing. Gaming time is so precious, and as we've joked about, it is so hard to get a scheduled session together. You don't want to waste any more time than you need to but you don't want to use any more of your gaming time than you need to on all of this stuff that it's important, but it's not stuff you want to have to deal with when you want to be like fighting dragons and like sneaking into hypertext and doing the hacking. You don't want to like take away from your playtime to do all of this logistical stuff. So do it all at the beginning with the session 0. And of course, the most important question, who buys the pizza? Is it the players? Is it the GM? Is it the person whose house it is? Or is it the people who don't live at the place it is? Because all of those make a kind of sense. All right, so that concludes the primary list of this stuff, and so now you are all set for your new campaigns. They will all be massive successes as long as you do all of the things that I said. But you have to do all of them, and if you miss even one, utter failure. I'm kidding, of course. Know your audience is still the primary thing that I hope everybody walks away from this with. All of the rest of the stuff is just advice that I've come across and had to deal with and tried to suss out, so I tried to make it easier for other people. So good luck, have fun. My name is Captain Mike, and I remain Captain Mike. I can be reached on the Discord as Captain Mike, and I can also be reached at captainmike@captainmike.net because I love my name. But do please put MAGFest in the subject line, or if you connect with me on Discord, send me a message or something letting me know that this is where you found me. So thank you very much, and I am happy to take any questions. Yes?
So the last time I ran session 0, all my players were brand new to the game. And when the question comes like, what do you expect from this campaign? What vibes are you looking for? Their answers were universally, we don't know, we trust you to do it.
Right, how can they know, so the comment was that the last session 0 that this game master ran, everyone was new to the game, so how do you know what you're getting into to even answer the question, what do you want out of this game? I would rephrase that, I think. Rather than what do you want out of this game, I would say what do you want to get out of the role-playing experience, if that doesn't sound too, like, snobby. Like, what do you want to get out of this role-playing experience? We only play Dungeons and Dragons. In the sense that, like, what is it that, like, are they looking to just, like, have fun? Are they looking to, like, find out why Dungeons and Dragons has gotten so popular lately? Are they looking to kind of, like, approach this as, like, a role-playing charcuterie where they can, like, try all of the different things in role-playing? Are they just there because it seemed so cool? Or are they there because they just want to hang out and this gives a structured way to hang out? Like, these are all entirely valid and not even discrete concepts. So I might phrase it like that. But in terms of, like, what do you want to get out of this story and the characters, I might think of it more as like a book or a movie. Like, do you want this to be like an action piece? Do you want to, like, do a bunch of cool action stuff? Do you want to do, like, a lot of thinky puzzles where it's more of a mystery solving sort of a thing? And kind of present these alternative elements to give them something that they can latch on to. Like, they've, I assume, seen movies and read books. That's what those things work. I teach English. Because anything that they can be familiar with, then they can kind of start drawing on for those ideas. And on a certain level, yeah, they might not know what they're getting into, but that's also kind of the nature of things. So, cool, thanks.
Just to add to that, in the case that your players don't necessarily know what their expectations are, I would say it might be safe to establish what you like to do as a DM, like the themes you like to hit, or like the mix of, like, role play or combat that you like. Particularly, like, what moves you as a DM if they don't already have expectations there.
Yeah, I agree. What works for you, and indeed, what works for the GM also has to be involved in the session 0 and just in the game in all. I think a lot of people who routinely game master for friends or for their groups, they kind of think of them, they get into the role where they're like, they have to present things, they have to give to the players. What is it the players are looking for? I will create this for you. But in a very strong way, the players are also creating something for the GM. The GM totally is allowed to get stuff out of it. This is a two-way street, or a 5 to 6-way street, depending on how you roll. All right, any other questions? Yes?
So obviously, every point that you put in the presentation, you're like, yeah, I stand by this.
I do.
What are those things? What is something
Literally.
that, like, was there a point that you were like, oh, yeah, no, I definitely understand the reason to do it, but, like, I don't get it. But then something happened in the campaign where you're like, oh, I now understand why that.
I feel like this is a subtle way of asking, have I ever messed this up? Because the answer is, I know all of these rules, I stand by all these rules, because I messed all of them. This is a panel born of blood and tears.
I just want a story.
You just want a story? Okay, a story about when I messed things up. Let's see, I talked about the two people who had the growl off for 5 minutes.
That was a perfect story.
Thank you. It's a very real story. They're still part of my core gaming group. I started doing session zeros quite a while ago, but it used to be very ordinary that we would all just kind of get together and either make characters separately and chill up. Okay, I'll tell you a time where I messed things up. And I was like, this was probably a shady thing for me to do. You may remember, recently I mentioned that I was in a campaign where it was Dungeons & Dragons, but we were all criminals. We were basically like a fantasy mafia. The Hobgoblin I played, you remember how I mentioned how the Psionics Handbook would just destroy campaigns? I had a copy of the Psionics Handbook, and I was like, it would be super cool if I rolled to see if I was like a wild talent, a like random half psionic sort of a character. And I totally did, and the GM was not prepared for that, and it wasn't really like a thing we had discussed. I just kind of he was like, yeah, just make your characters. And I was like, okay, well these rules in this add-on that no one else is using say I can do this thing. So the Hobgoblin I was playing was not only super strong, he was also psychically strong, which meant that he could just ignore pain and could fully heal himself in a day, because that's the level of balance that rule set had, while no one else could. So I had kind of accidentally walked in with like this unstoppable death machine, and I was the enforcer of the group, which was a lot of fun for me, but the GM would be like, okay, here's a tough scenario, and I would just steamroll through it. And then he would be like, okay, here's another scenario, and I would just steamroll through it. And so he's like, okay, here's clonk, here's an enemy that is going to stop you. But the problem is I wasn't there that day. So everybody else had to take care of it. And it was the kind of thing where I look back on that and I love that story because he rolled with the punches, so to speak. Like my GM was just absolutely amazing. And he found the balance for me to have this like total tank of a character versus everyone else is sort of like weasels and like mafiosi of characters. And we played it, and I definitely kept things, I tried to like work with him so I didn't just like do terrible things and then get away with no consequences. But it was probably something where we really should have ironed that out ahead of time. I think that would have made a lot of the early stuff a lot more cohesive and reasonable, and he would not have been quite as surprised, and maybe the party wouldn't have spent as much time in traction. So there's those kinds of things. Certainly, I can't count the number of games I've had where we would all get together and we'd play the first session of something and then we'd never be able to schedule another game because none of us had compatible schedules for the next decade. The number of dead campaigns just used to litter my room. I would just like, oh, those 3 people will never be in the same room again. That guy moved to Japan. So, you know, in an age before the internet, that was just not happening. So, does that work?
Yes.
Some good stories?
I just want a story, so it's perfect.
Nice. Any other questions, comments, concerns, compliments on my person?
Great.
Thank you. I love that. All right. Well, we are just about in time anyway. I will be remaining in case anybody has any questions, but they didn't want to ask them in front of an entire audience. So all that remains is for me to once again thank you very much for braving the cold. I am and remain Captain Mike. And I will see you for the rest of MAGFest and hopefully at the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one.